Right, so welcome to key issue 10.3, where is agriculture distributed? Mainly this is about where the different agricultures around the world are distributed, the different types, what kind of environment they're in, are they subsistence, are they commercial? So the very first thing we want to kind of look at here is how many do we have? Derwent Whittlesley, old geographer, basically identified that there was 11 different regions in the world that could actually sustain solid agriculture. The one that couldn't is the tundra, so technically there are 12, but overall, really, we're only going to look at 11. 5 of them are in developing countries, and 6 are going to be in developed. Now, keep in mind, developing doesn't just mean subsistence. They do have a commercial one, which will be plantation. And then also keep in mind, developed does not just mean commercial, but for the most part, all of those in developed countries are commercial. Now, moving on here, we're going to look at Whittlesley's map here of the world. These are all the different agricultures that he came up with, that he identified in the world, that he could generalize together. Notice the similarities between the types of agriculture, all right, and the climate in the world. So you have the tropical region here. Notice the kind of shifting cultivation you have here. Pastoral nomadism is here, but it's also a very semi-arid, dry environment over here as well. So make sure you guys understand the connections between the two. In agriculture regions, the developing parts of the world, you're going to have people who produce mainly food for themselves or their family for consumption. This is going to be subsistence. However, they do sometimes have a surplus and they may sell that for income around the world or to local villages. However, the primary purpose of them farming is to simply feed their families. The first type of developing region we have here for agriculture is pastoral nomadism. They're not growing any crops, simply they are herding their domesticated animals from place to place in the world, or in their region I should say. Usually this is adopted in a dry or arid climate. Usually they're using this land because it's not suitable for crops. So instead of using it for crops, they're using it for their animals to graze over, to eat all the vegetation they can, and then they're going to herd them to another spot. For the most part, they do not use these animals for meat. They live largely off of grain, the nomads here do. What they use the herds for are for secondary products that the animals may produce, like cheese, or they can be later sold for income for other people. This leads us to a term here called transhumance. Basically, this is the seasonal migration of herds between mountain and lowland pasture areas, mainly because if it gets too cold in one spot, there's not enough vegetation, so they move to the highlands, all right, eat the vegetation. Once it gets warmer, they move back down to the lowland areas to ensure that they have enough vegetation for their animals. The next one we're going to look at here, we have shifting cultivation. Shifting cultivation you definitely need to associate with subsistence and developing parts of the world. This is basically a slash and burn technique that is used regularly through shifting cultivation. In the middle of a forest here, they'll cut down some trees, they'll burn them. All the nutrients will help the soil get rich in nutrients, which will then help their crops grow. They use this for about 3 to 4 years, and then they move on, and then after a couple of years of putting some fallow in that area, they're able to eventually come back to that area, but usually they shift from one spot to another, and I'll show you that on the next page here. Keep in mind this is not done with a lot of modern machinery. Most of this is done by hand. In addition, in developing worlds, especially in South America, this is pretty common. However, a lot of the lands were usually used by a communal aspect. Many people own the land, they shared the land. But now you have a lot of private landowners who are buying up this land and using it for commercial agriculture to send to the developed world. So keep that in mind. That might be a problem for shifting cultivation to kind of sustain itself for the next couple years. So here's a good image of shifting cultivation. They clear the area, they burn it down, they get all the nutrients into the ground. After 3 to 4 years, they move over to the next area, clear it, burn it down, get the nutrients into the soil, and they continue to do this over and over again. So the next one we have is intensive subsistence, which is in the developing world. This agriculture involves a lot of intense labor in a small amount of area. That's why they call it intensive subsistence. So you're going to take a really small area of land and you're going to try to get the most out of it as possible. Basically, 3/4 of the food consumed in the developing world comes from this kind of agriculture. Again, usually most of the work is done by hand or with animal to kind of support your agricultural practices, but usually this is done in areas where labor is really expensive, or you cannot get a lot of machinery because it's very expensive as well. So if you cannot afford the machinery, this is kind of the agriculture you're doing in a lot of the world. Keep in mind, due to high agricultural density, the average farm is small, but they farm it very intensively, sorry, mainly because they do not have enough space there. Moving along here, the next thing we have is intensive subsistence with wet rice. Make sure you're looking at these images here. Understand that wet rice, again, is grown in wet areas, especially a lot of monsoon areas in the world. The problem with this is it leads to extensive modification of the landscape. Many places you can see it's too hilly to farm, and what they do is this technique called terracing. This is something we need to know here. Basically, they cut into the hill to try to get these flat areas here. If you don't cut into the hill and you try growing on the flat areas, all the nutrients are going to be washed down, all the water is going to be washed down. But if you terrace it, if you cut into the hill and make these little flat areas, the arable land that you want, or the non-arable land, is now arable because now you can farm this area. So imagine if all these terraces weren't here, it would look very hilly. You probably couldn't actually grow anything there. But by terracing, you're able to take what you really couldn't farm and intensively farm it as much as possible. Another strategy they kind of use in this area is double cropping. Basically, during the warm months, they grow rice, and then during the colder months, okay, during the winter, they have fruits and vegetables out there that they can kind of grow in more drier climate. So our next type of agriculture we're going to look at is plantation agriculture. A few things to keep in mind for this. One, it does happen in the developing world, and two, it is a commercial type of agriculture in the developing world. Usually they use cash crops, which are usually grown on big, large estates. The single crop, they try to make as much as possible, but basically most of these plantations are owned by Europeans or Americans. They just actually farm it in the developing worlds, and then they take these resources and they bring them back to these local areas, America and in Europe, and then they sell it off to everybody else. For the companies, they take advantage of the cheap labor. However, very, very little machines are kind of used for this kind of farming. Things that are cash crops would be cotton, sugar, coffee, rubber, exotic fruit, and other cash crops that are common on plantations. Example you have here, think about your dole. This is a banana plantation. So simply they get really cheap labor, take advantage of it, and then they sell this back to the developed world. So for our next regions we're going to look at are the agricultural regions of the developed world. Again, keep in mind most of this is made for money, most of it is commercial. They're using it as a business to make money, not to eat the actual crops. This is kind of referred to as agribusiness. Basically, you want to keep in mind that this business is not simply people on their family farms are not simply just growing crops for themselves. They already have a deal. They're going to sell it to another company who's then going to sell it to a food production company. So this is a really big food processing system that is going on in the developed worlds. So our first kind of agriculture we're going to look at for the developed worlds is going to be mixed crop and livestock. Keep in mind this is going to have two parts. So you're going to have your crops and then you're going to have livestock. So it's not just livestock and it's not just crops. The whole point of this is that they grow a lot of the crops to feed to the livestock. So instead of letting them roam around everywhere and using an abundance of land, what they're going to do is they're going to feed or grow a lot of the feed on their property and then feed it to the animals later on. Most of the animals that they end up using for this can later be used for other products. The most important one is corn. Remember in the video, most of the livestock in the country is fed corn. Part of the reason is corn has a high yield to it, therefore they're going to get much more bang for their buck when they feed it to the animals. Another thing that comes with this is a thing called crop rotation. Basically each year or every few years they rotate where they plant the crops. So if you have corn on the left side one year, the next year you might plant it on the right side, and a couple years later you might plant it in the middle. The reason for this is if you continue to grow the same crop in the same soil, it's going to be depleted over the years. Thus, if they rotate it, they can keep the high yields, they can get a lot of food for their animals, therefore they're going to get more money for their animals at the end game of that. Next agriculture we're going to look at is also commercial in the developed world. It's going to be dairy farming. Those of us in Wisconsin should be pretty familiar with this dairy farming. Not only does it provide milk, but other products, cheese, yogurt, etc., anything that includes dairy. Key thing about this is obviously they do have a lot of livestock, but they're not using it for the meat. Obviously they're using it for the dairy product. there's this idea called the milk shed. Basically, a milk shed is how far you can be from your store when you are a dairy farmer. So if you get past the milk shed, your milk and dairy is going to spoil, therefore it's not going to make you any money. So for years this has grown and grown with the advancement of transportation. So early on the milk shed might be 20 miles because that's the farthest the farmer could actually sell that stuff before it expired. With the advent of more transportation, trucks, trains, you now have about 300 miles is the rough milk shed in the United States till today. So mostly your milk that you buy at the store, Pick and Save, Woodman's, if you go there, you look to see where it was produced. Notice that it's more than likely it's within that 300-mile radius, probably a lot closer than 300 miles. That's kind of the max extent of that. While we know in the United States we're really big on dairy, India has overtaken the world leader of producing milk per day. Kind of give you a global understanding of this, here is kind of the global dairy map. Notice India is the only one over 100 million metric tons per year that it produces. Obviously the developed world, the United States, Brazil, Europe is definitely high on dairy. Also keep in mind a lot of sub-Saharan Africa and Southeastern Asian countries, for many different reasons, economic, not having enough land, not having a good enough land for the dairy cows, are part of the reasons why they're not that high on the dairy list. Next, developed one is going to be grain farming. Grain farming should be pretty familiar to us, especially the Food Inc. video we watched. When you look at grain farming, keep in mind that most of the wheat that we grow in the United States is going to be later made into other products. Think about when you go to the store, all the stuff with high carbs, anything with flour, that is all going to come from wheat. Over here you have a nice little picture of wheat here. Make sure you kind of understand what wheat is, how it looks a little bit different than corn, different color, different texture, etc. A good characteristic of grain farming is simply that it's mechanic. It's very mechanical. You have a lot of these machines. Today we use combines. Back in the day, in the 1850s, early 1800s, they used the reaper, which made it a lot easier. But basically, combine blends in reaping, threshing, and actually cleaning all of the seeds in a single operation. While the United States does have a high amount of grain farming, China and India produce more wheat than the United States does. However, they do this through a lot of manual labor, not with as many tractors as we use here in the United States. Keep in mind, a good storage place for these are silos. So if you see these silos around, definitely know that there's going to be grain in there. You do have corn silos as well. But for the most part, a lot of people in the United States use this to kind of store their wheat. Our fourth commercial slash developed agriculture we're going to look at is Mediterranean agriculture. This one really doesn't tell us what they're growing. More importantly, it actually tells us where these are going to be grown. Mediterranean, you want to think of the Mediterranean climate. Think about the Mediterranean Sea here. Very moderate temperature, very breezy. A key about this is usually you're going to find them on western coast on continents near the sea. California is a Mediterranean environment. Central Chile's environment is a Mediterranean environment. Southern and western coast of Africa here. Same thing for Australia, but here's the heart of it is the Mediterranean Sea, hence why they call it the Mediterranean agriculture. Things that are grown there, you're going to see olives, you're going to be seeing grapes. Olives obviously can be turned into oil. Grapes, another big product that grapes are using is wine production. But keep in mind when you see a map of California, the Mediterranean Sea, know that it's probably Mediterranean type agriculture, and know that it's always on the western coast of continents. Western coast, western coast, western coast, and western coast, if you kind of look up Europe and Asia as one coast. For the most part, when we've looked at agriculture, you have livestock and we talked about grain farming. If you're growing fruits, vegetables, and flowers, kind of the smaller items, if you will, the stuff you see at farmers market, that is actually going to be called horticulture. So it's part of agriculture, but if you talk about horticulture, people are going to understand that you're growing fruits, vegetables, and flowers. Alright, so now we're going to move something very similar to Mediterranean agriculture. Is going to be commercial gardening. You're going to have still fruits and vegetables. The only difference is that these are not usually grown in the Mediterranean climate. Commercial gardening is basically going to be a lot of these specialty fruits you'll find in the United States that people want. Not really high in demand, but they can get a lot of money for them. So not high in demand, but when people do want them, they are willing to pay a lot of money for them. This is also called truck farming, not simply because it's on a truck. Truck used to be the old word for bartering, so people would barter. How much do you want? will ask for this price and you'll go back and forth bartering. So that used to be called trucking. So today they continue to call it truck farming, but not necessarily because it's on trucks. For the most part, this used to be a very local kind of agriculture where you would grow it and you would sell it to people local. Now it's a little bit wider with modern transportation. People have diffused ideas of the kind of fruits and vegetables they want. This has spread throughout the United States. So something that used to be only grown in Washington might now be still grown in Washington, but now sent over to Missouri or Wisconsin or Iowa because many different people now want that kind of fruit or vegetable throughout the country. One big important characteristic of this, especially you'll see in a lot of the warmer climates of the United States, they rely heavily on cheap migrant labor to save on labor costs. Again, remember a lot of these fruits and vegetables are very high in price, so if we can get cheap labor for it, you are going to be able to sell that to more people and broaden your base of who wants your items. Last one we're going to look at for the developed world is going to be commercial, which will be ranching. Simply, this is raising livestock, but you're letting them graze. So basically, you're letting them roam about. That's how they're eating. You don't have to grow the food. You can just let them roam on the land. They'll eat the grass that's available to them. You'll move them out later on. Think about more cowboys. This is why they're called cowboys, because they're taking care of cows. This is usually reserved for semi-arid or arid land that's not really that good for growing crops, wheat, and corn, etc. Historically, most ranchers move cattle from the ranges to the cities. That's kind of what the job of the cowboy was. They took them from the ranch to the city. But now with the advent of modern transportation, especially the railroad system, they can now just lead them to the railroads. They can now just lead them to the trucking places, or the truck places can come to them and they can take the livestock to the trains, and now they can be sent to the cities. Today, cattle is again a part of the larger system of food production, providing meat to the national market. Essentially, you are not just growing this cattle and selling it to your neighbor. You're now raising this cattle and you're selling it to a big food company who are now selling them to fast food chains, to your local markets, etc. Other than the United States, that it's pretty common. Note that it's not common everywhere in the United States, mainly the West and the Southwest. South America has a big ranching industry, so does Australia. Keep in mind, Australia has the outback, so a lot of that area that's not really good for growing crops might be good for ranching. And then Central Asia as well.